Welcome back. Now that we understand what enterprise architecture is and why it's important, you might be wondering, how do we actually do EA in practice? This is where architectural frameworks come into play. An EA framework is like a cookbook for architects. It provides a step-by-step method, templates, and best practices to develop your architecture. In this session, we focus on SAP's Enterprise Architecture Framework, a methodology that SAP developed to guide enterprise architects, especially in SAP-centric projects. Adopting a framework ensures we don't approach architecture in an ad hoc way. Instead, we follow a proven process that covers all bases from initial vision through to governance and leverages industry standards so we're not reinventing the wheel. Nestlé's journey provides a powerful example. The global giant undertook a massive transformation program dubbed GLOBE to unify business processes and systems across 100 plus countries. From the start, Nestlé applied a structured enterprise architecture methodology aligned with SAP's EA framework, establishing a standardized enterprise-wide business process architecture and data model as a global templates. Using this methodology in clearly defined phases, the company's experts developed the template and rolled it out in waves across its markets. By adhering to these EA phases and guidelines, Nestlé harmonized processes and platforms worldwide, transforming a patchwork of local practices into one cohesive way of working. This success story sets the stage for our session, highlighting how a structured framework can guide massive transformations with clarity and consistency. To motivate why a framework is helpful, imagine being tasked with re-architecting your company's IT landscape for a digital transformation initiative. Without a methodology, you might feel overwhelmed. There are so many stakeholders to talk to, documents to create, and complex interdependencies to consider. It's easy to miss something important. A framework like SAP's provides a roadmap. It tells you what phases to go through, what artifacts, deliverables to produce at each step, and how to maintain alignment with business objectives throughout. SAP's EA framework is not built from scratch in isolation. Rather, it stands on the shoulders of giants like the open groups TOGAF, adapting those global best practices to the SAP context. This means if you're familiar with standard EA approaches, SAP's method will feel familiar, yet it adds SAP-specific content and accelerators that make it extremely practical for SAP projects. SAP Enterprise Architecture Framework, often just called the SAP EA methodology, is essentially a tailored version of the TOGAF Architecture Development Method, ADM. TOGAF's ADM, if you recall or have heard of it, is a cyclical process that enterprise architects use to develop architectures, starting from an initial architecture vision, moving through detailed domains, business architecture, information systems architecture, technology architecture, then planning, implementation, opportunities and solutions, migration planning, and overseeing governance. SAP has embraced this general flow: architecture vision, business architecture, information, data, application, architecture, technology architecture, solutions and roadmap, and so on, and refined it to align with SAP's own reference models and the realities of SAP solution implementation. In fact, SAP is using the latest TOGAF version 10 ADM as the basis, with some extensions. One key extension is the inclusion of additional or updated artifacts that reflect modern practices. For example, SAP's methodology suggests using a business model canvas, in particular a sustainable business model canvas, during the initial vision or strategy phase. This is a tool popularized in the startup and innovation world to capture how a company creates and delivers value. And SAP recommends it to ensure the architecture work begins with a clear understanding of the business model, including sustainability aspects, which are increasingly important. Another example is the application use case diagram that SAP added to the arsenal of artifacts. Traditional TOGAF might not explicitly mention such a diagram, but SAP found it useful to depict how users and applications interact in specific scenarios, helping to clarify requirements for SAP solutions. These enhancements show SAP's focus on practicality. The framework isn't just theory, it's informed by years of field experience in SAP customer projects. Let's outline the major phases or components of the SAP EA methodology in sequence. Architecture vision is the starting point. In this phase, architects work with executives and stakeholders to define the scope and high-level objectives of the architecture engagement. What business problem are we trying to solve? What's the desired outcome? Deliverables here might include a vision document or statement of architecture work, basically the charter for the EA project. SAP often encourages including tools like the business model canvas and a high-level stakeholder map to know who cares about this architecture at this stage. The idea is to get everyone aligned on the North Star and the constraints assumptions before diving into details. Next is strategy and motivation, sometimes considered part of the vision phase. SAP's framework puts strong emphasis on linking architecture to strategy. This could involve documenting business drivers, principles, and strategic requirements. Artifacts like architecture principles and a business motivation model capturing goals and drivers come into play. For instance, you might document a principle such as digital solutions should be cloud first whenever feasible to guide all subsequent designs. These principles become a touchstone when making decisions later, like do we custom build a solution or use a cloud service? Check the principles. In SAP's methodology, these are not afterthoughts. They are explicitly captured to ensure the architecture has a firm business-driven foundation. Remember, use proven standards and don't start from scratch. Many organizations adopt similar sets of principles. In the business architecture phase, architects model and analyze the business aspects. You might create a business capability map, a structured depiction of what the business does, and business process maps for key areas. Other possible artifacts, organization charts, value streams showing how value is delivered end to end, and business context diagrams that illustrate the high-level interactions between the business and outside parties or between business functions. For example, a business context diagram for a retail company might show how the sales department interacts with marketing, inventory, and external customer suppliers. The goal of this phase is to identify what the business needs from the architecture, capabilities to improve, processes to optimize, without jumping to IT solutions yet. It sets the stage for ensuring the subsequent IT architecture truly supports the business design. Next is Solution Information Systems Architecture, which is where we design the application and data architecture to meet the business needs. In SAP's framework, this is sometimes split into application architecture and data architecture, or collectively referred to as solution architecture. Key artifacts here would include an application landscape diagram showing all the software components and their interactions, data models and data flow diagrams, and definitions of solution components, which could be specific SAP modules, microservices, databases, and so on. One artifact SAP highlights is the solution concept diagram, essentially a high-level design of how a particular solution will work within the enterprise context. For example, how an e-commerce platform integrates with SAP backend and payment gateways. There's also often a solution architecture blueprint, which is a more detailed design covering components, their responsibilities, and integration points. The SAP EA meta model, more on this soon, ensures that as we create these artifacts, we keep consistent definitions. For example, if customer database appears in a data flow and an application diagram, they refer to the same concept. Next is technology architecture. Here, we decide on the technical infrastructure. Artifacts could be environment diagrams depicting environments like development, QA, production, and how systems are deployed in each, infrastructure diagrams, networks, servers, cloud services layout, and even technology standards catalogs. For instance, an artifact might be a list of approved technology products or cloud services that the architecture will use. For example, database in SAP HANA Cloud or integration SAP Integration Suite, ensuring consistency and compliance with IT standards. SAP's methodology would incorporate any reference architectures available. For example, SAP's reference architecture for the intelligent enterprise, which outlines a recommended tech stack and integration approach across SAP's products. If you're using SAP's business technology platform, this phase would clarify which components of BTP are involved, like SAP Analytics Cloud, identity services, and so on. The outcome is a clear plan for the underlying tech required for the solution, aligned with both SAP best practices and the company's IT environment. Roadmap and transition is opportunities and solutions plus migration planning. Once the target architecture across business solution tech is defined, the question becomes, how do we get there? This phase produces the implementation roadmap. You break down the future state into work packages, projects, or transition architectures, intermediate states on the journey. SAP's EA framework provides guidance on prioritizing initiatives, perhaps using impact effort matrices, and sequencing them in a roadmap, diagram, or table. This could be a multi-year plan if it's a big transformation. The roadmap should also align with any ongoing projects, so you might include a portfolio catalog of current initiatives and identify quick win opportunities versus longer term investments. A related artifact is the benefits case or value realization plan, tying each roadmap step to expected business value, which is important for stakeholder buy-in. In SAP-led architectures, you'd ensure that dependencies like we must implement SAP S/4HANA before we can leverage embedded analytics are clearly noted. The roadmap phase is where EA meets project planning, ensuring that the grand architecture vision is translated into actionable steps. Next is requirements and governance. Throughout all the above, the SAP EA methodology stresses governance and requirements management. Architects don't work in a vacuum. They track requirements, functional and non-functional, and ensure the architecture addresses them. There are usually artifacts like a requirements catalog and compliance assessments. In practice, this means setting up an architecture review board or similar governance body that will review designs at key checkpoints to ensure they conform to the established architecture and principles. SAP's framework aligns with TOGAF on this, advocating continuous monitoring and governance so that as projects execute, they don't deviate from the planned architecture without due consideration. For instance, if during a project a team wants to introduce a new tool not in the defined tech standards. An EA governance process would catch that and evaluate it against the principles and overall design. The result is fewer nasty surprises, shadow-eyed or one-off solutions creeping in, and a controlled evolution of the enterprise landscape. It's important to note that while I've described these phases sequentially, the SAP EA methodology, like TOGAF, is highly iterative. Architects often loop back. For example, discovering a constraint in technology might cause a rethink of some business process requirement, or evolving business strategy may adjust the vision. SAP explicitly represents its method not as a strict waterfall, but as a metro map where many activities can happen in parallel and feed into each other. This iterative nature is crucial for agility. In fast-moving projects, say an agile SAP implementation, you might iterate through mini cycles of architecture, refining the business processes, then solution design, then checking alignment with principles in sprints or waves. Let me ask you a reflective question. Have you experienced projects where plans had to change mid-course? How might an iterative architecture approach handle that better than a rigid plan? The point is that a good methodology provides guidance but also flexibility to adapt as you learn new information. Underpinning SAP's methodology is something called a meta model. If the framework is the process, the how, the meta model is about the what. It defines the building blocks of architecture and how they relate to each other. In simpler terms, a meta model is a model of the models. It specifies all the key concepts we deal with in enterprise architecture, like business capability, process, application component, data entity, technology component, and so on, and the relationships between them. This ensures that all the artifacts we produce can fit together consistently. For instance, the meta model might dictate that business processes realize business capabilities, or that applications support certain business capabilities and produce/consume data objects. By following a meta model, when you create a business capability map and an application landscape, you can later map which applications support which capabilities because you used a common vocabulary and structure. SAP's EA meta model is closely aligned with the TOGAF content meta model and also draws from industry standards. However, SAP has included specific concepts relevant to SAP environments. For example, SAP talks about solution capabilities and solution processes. These relate to the functionality of software solutions, often SAP products, and how they implement business processes. There are concepts like communication channel and data flow to model integration points, or deployment unit, which could represent a grouping of software deployed together. By defining these, the meta model helps architects comprehensively model the enterprise across all domains. The SAP EA methodology guide provides a glossary of these terms so that everyone in the EA team uses them consistently. This avoids the scenario where one document calls something a function and another calls it a capability and a third calls it a module, which can create confusion if not normalized. Let's look at an example of meta model use. Suppose you're creating an architecture repository, a central place to store all EA artifacts, often supported by a tool. Thanks to the meta model, you can store objects like customer management capability, link it to processes like manage customer complaints, link those to applications like SAP C/4HANA Service Cloud, link those to data objects like customer master data, and link further to technology like CRM database server. Later, if someone asks where is the customer master data used, you can query the repository and see all the places it appears because the relationships were captured. This kind of traceability is hugely beneficial for impact analysis. SAP's meta model essentially sets you up to do this kind of analysis because it encourages you to capture those relationships in each deliverable. For instance, a solution data flow diagram will explicitly show data entities and the applications that exchange them, which aligns with meta model relations. In addition to concepts and relationships, the meta model often defines attributes for each concept. For example, a business capability might have attributes like a description, a maturity level, an owner, and so on. SAP's framework likely provides templates for these. By keeping such information, you enrich the architecture documentation. For example, listing an owner for each capability or system ensures accountability. One of SAP's EA principles is clearly defining ownership of architecture content. Another principle is content fluency and collaboration, meaning architects and stakeholders should share a common taxonomy, exactly what a meta model and glossary facilitate. Throughout the phases we outlined, the SAP EA methodology yields a number of artifacts, tangible work products that capture the architecture. We've already mentioned many by name: business capability map, architecture vision document, solution diagram, roadmap, and so on. Let's spotlight a few key artifacts that you will likely encounter or create. Business capability map is a structured diagram or catalog that lists the business capabilities of the organization, usually grouped into categories. This artifact is great for engaging business stakeholders since it uses their language, capabilities like marketing, sales, customer service, R&D, and so on, and shows where the company's strengths and weaknesses are. In SAP EA, capability maps are recommended to ensure we have clarity on what needs support before deciding how to support it. You might mark which capabilities are supported by SAP systems, which are manual, which need investment, and so on, as a basis for planning. Next is stakeholder matrix or map, which identifies stakeholders, business and IT, involved in or impacted by the architecture work. It may also document their concerns and what views of the architecture they care about. For example, a CFO might care about the capability map and a high-level systems view, whereas a security officer cares about data flows and security architecture. By mapping this out, you can tailor communication and ensure every concern is addressed by some artifact or analysis. Architecture principles, which we discussed these principles earlier. Typically, there are a concise set of guiding statements, each accompanied by rationale and implications designed to steer decisions clearly. For example, a principle might state, maximize reuse of standard SAP functionality before considering custom development. Keeping these principles visible ensures that teams consistently make strategic choices aligned with business objectives. Next, let's consider the solution concept diagram, a one-page visual summary capturing the essence of the proposed solution architecture for a specific initiative. It typically illustrates user interactions through the interface, the backend systems involved, data flow paths, and any external systems or parties engaged. Think of this diagram as an executive level summary of your technical approach, ideal for swiftly securing approval and alignment. Building upon the solution concept diagram, the solution architecture document, often known as a blueprint, is a more detailed, comprehensive document consolidating the solution's design. It frequently includes several diagrams, such as application component diagrams, integration diagrams, and data models, alongside thorough textual descriptions. In SAP projects, this document resembles the older blueprint document from SAP's ASAP methodology, describing precisely how business requirements translate into the system design. The SAP EA framework ensures the structure and comprehensiveness of this document, covering business process modifications, application adjustments, data considerations, technology choices, security implications, and their clear alignment to original requirements. Following this detailed blueprint is the roadmap and transition plan, typically presented as a timeline, often resembling a Gantt chart or phased roadmap diagram. It details various projects or work packages. It highlights milestones such as scheduled rollouts of specific SAP modules, clarifies dependencies between initiatives, and depicts interim architecture states. This roadmap often comes with an associated migration plan outlining the migration of data and processes from legacy systems to new platforms. For example, detailing how you'll archive legacy ERP data or manage interfaces during phased SAP deployments. Finally, though perhaps less glamorous, we have the governance log and compliance assessments. These documents maintain a clear record of architectural decisions, dispensations when exceptions to standard procedures are required, and outcomes from compliance reviews. Their importance can't be overstated for long-term governance. After each project, the log captures actual implementations compared to initial plans, noting adherence to architectural principles or documenting approved compromises clearly. The SAP EA methodology provides a recommended set of artifacts for each phase, domain, and even marks some as optional depending on the project scope. It's not necessary to produce every artifact for every project. Good architects use judgment. For a small-scale change, you might not need a full-blown 50-page architecture document. A few diagrams might suffice. The framework is modular in that sense. SAP actually depicts this in a visual metro map chart. Imagine a subway map showing which artifacts are typically produced, and one can pick the relevant ones. The key is, don't skip the thinking just because you skip a document. If an artifact is deemed unnecessary, it should be because the matter is trivial or covered elsewhere, not because we forgot about that aspect. For example, you might not create a separate technology architecture document if your solution is purely cloud-based SaaS, where the tech infrastructure is abstracted, but you still would consider tech-related requirements like security and performance in your overall design. You might ask, couldn't we just use generic TOGAF or another framework? What's the real advantage of SAP's flavor? Great question. The advantage of SAP's EA framework is that it blends industry standard methodology with SAP-specific best practices and content. In practice, this means you have access to models and examples that are directly relevant to common SAP scenarios. For instance, whereas TOGAF might say define data architecture, SAP's framework can point you to reference data models for, say, a retail industry, or suggest using the APQC process classification framework to ensure you've covered all typical business processes. SAP also ties its methodology to actual tools. They recommend using tools like SAP Signavio for process modeling, Linux for architecture repository, SAP's own business transformation suite, and so on, to accelerate the work. These tools come preloaded with templates aligned to the framework. Imagine opening a template repository and finding a ready-made SAP S/4HANA migration roadmap template or a capability map for manufacturing industry that you can adapt. That jumpstart can save weeks of effort and make your deliverables more standardized. Additionally, SAP's framework emphasizes EA as a service function within an organization. It describes a set of services that enterprise architects provide, such as developing an architecture vision, doing innovation road mapping, conducting target architecture assessments, and so on. This perspective is helpful for organizations to define the role of EA internally, not just as a one-time project role, but an ongoing function that supports various needs: strategy planning, project governance, innovation evaluation, and so on. It positions EA practitioners as valuable advisors to the business, which is exactly the reputation you want your EA practice to have. Ultimately, Nestlé's story reinforces that a structured EA methodology is pivotal for executing transformations at global scale. Throughout the program, the team relied on formal architecture artifacts like business capability maps, standardized process models, and solution diagrams. All of these were aligned through a common EA meta model and guided by clear principles and governance, keeping the entire initiative on strategy. Such practices ensured that every local deployment remained true to the global blueprint, preserving architectural integrity and business alignment. Now consider your own organization. How can you apply a similar EA framework to guide a large-scale initiative? Which architecture artifacts or governance practices would help ensure consistency and clarity in your projects? How will you make sure your architecture stays aligned with your strategic goals as your enterprise evolves? By adopting SAP's enterprise architecture framework, organizations equip themselves with a structured, repeatable approach to planning and executing transformation. Instead of relying on heroics or starting from zero with each project, the framework provides a common language and process for everyone involved. In this session, we walked through the phases of the methodology, from architecture vision to governance, touched on the underlying meta model that keeps everything connected, and highlighted key artifacts you'd produce. The big takeaway is that using a methodology leads to more consistent and complete architectures. It also makes it easier to onboard new team members, measure progress, and integrate with other practices like project management and agile development. Before we proceed further, let us take a moment to reflect on these questions. How does your organization currently plan IT or SAP projects? Is there a formal methodology in place? And if so, how does it compare to what we discussed? If there isn't one, think about a recent project. Were there any missteps that a more structured EA approach might have prevented? For example, late discovery of a dependency or a solution that didn't fit the business need. Which artifact or phase of the SAP EA methodology do you anticipate providing the most value in your context? For instance, some might find that creating a business capability map brings clarity between business and IT teams, while others might value the roadmap phase to align leadership on implementation timing. Identifying this can help you focus on mastering that aspect of the framework. What do you foresee as the main challenge in implementing an EA framework in your organization? Perhaps it's getting executive buy-in, or maybe the challenge is cultural. For example, teams not used to documenting architecture. By anticipating challenges like ensuring people follow the governance process or keeping the repository updated, you can plan strategies to address them, such as executive sponsorship, training, or tool support. With a solid grasp of SAP's methodology now in your toolkit, you're better prepared to craft and manage architectures in an SAP environment. In the next session, we'll zoom out a bit and see how this framework aligns with broader industry standards like TOGAF and why that alignment is beneficial. Keep your questions and observations in mind. We'll connect the dots between SAP's approach and the wider world of EA best practices next.